Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Shroudex. Does the black moon howl? No, that's not a riddle. Inside the file we're covering today, it's a password, and getting the answer wrong isn't a small mistake. It's the kind of mistake that ends careers, ends lives, and in the oldest layers of this story may have ended entire civilizations before the Foundation existed to write any of it down. Last time on this channel, we opened the front door to SCP-001, the single most contested number in this entire archive, filled with dozens of competing, mutually exclusive answers to the same impossible question. We covered one of those answers. Today we're covering a very different one, bigger in scope, older than recorded history, and, by the time it's finished, one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing this archive has ever produced. This is Tanhony's Proposal. This is the Black Moon. One programming note before we start. This file is unusually long, even by this archive's standards, spanning what its own supporting material implies is thousands of years of in-universe history. We're not going to rush it. If the last episode felt like watching a single terrible day unfold in real time, this one is going to feel like watching an entire civilization quietly hold its breath across generations. Settle in. Object Class Keter. And that alone tells you something important before we go any further, because it separates this file immediately from the one we covered last time. Apollyon, remember, means the Foundation has already lost. Keter means the fight is still happening. Difficult, expensive, never guaranteed, but happening. Where the last proposal we covered was the sound of an organization running out of options, this file is the sound of an organization that has been quietly, desperately fighting the exact same war for longer than most of human history has existed, and still refuses to call it lost. That fight starts with a phrase you'll hear repeated throughout this file, treated less like a question and more like a piece of scripture. Does the black moon howl? No. It reads, on the surface, like a childish nursery rhyme, the kind of call and response you'd expect from folklore rather than a classified document. But inside this proposal, it functions as a security check, a verbal password confirming that whoever's answering is still themselves, still safe, still uncompromised. The fact that the Foundation's highest security clearance eventually comes down to a line that sounds like it belongs in a lullaby is exactly the kind of detail that makes this file unforgettable. Think about what a password like that is actually designed to catch. Not an intruder without clearance, not a hostile agent from a rival organization. A password phrased like folkverse, passed down and repeated exactly, is designed to catch something else entirely. A person who used to be trusted and might not be anymore, without either of you fully realizing it yet. That single design choice tells you everything about what kind of threat this file is actually building toward, long before it explains a single mechanic of what the Black Moon does. According to the file, SCP-001 in this proposal is an entropic entity of considerable power, believed to exist entirely outside conventional reality. Pre-Foundation records, spanning further back than almost anything else in this archive, refer to it simply as the Black Moon. The file dates its most recent formal update to the closing years of the 1980s, a small, almost mundane detail sitting at the very top of an otherwise cosmic document, and that mismatch is worth noticing on its own. A threat old enough to predate written language, still being formally reviewed and refiled on a schedule as ordinary as any other piece of Foundation paperwork. That's the tone this entire proposal is going to keep returning to. The biggest possible stakes, processed through the smallest, most human bureaucratic habits imaginable. Its method of harm is almost elegant in how little it resembles a typical Keter-class threat. No claws, no biological horror, no breach alarms. The Black Moon's influence manifests as the sudden, random obliteration of conscious organisms, a victim transmuted instantly into a solid black substance that disappears completely within 4 seconds. No body, no remains, No trace left behind for anyone to study, mourn, or even fully confirm happened at all, apart from whoever was standing close enough to watch it. Consider what that absence of evidence actually does to the people investigating it across centuries of this file's timeline. Every other threat this channel has covered leaves something behind. Wreckage, injuries, containment breach logs, a body to identify. This one leaves a person-shaped hole in the world and nothing else, which means every single obliteration the Foundation's predecessors ever documented had to be built entirely out of witness testimony, never physical evidence, across a span of history where witness testimony was the least reliable form of record humanity had. It's a threat almost perfectly designed to erase its own paper trail alongside its victims. For most of recorded history, according to the file, these obliterations were staggeringly rare. Once every few decades, based on historical testimony, rare enough that entire generations could live and die without directly witnessing one, rare enough to become myth instead of headline news. But the file includes a warning attributed to the one source closest to this anomaly of anyone alive, and that warning is the real engine driving the entire proposal forward. The frequency and the speed of these obliterations is expected to increase exponentially over time. Whatever the Black Moon is, it isn't static. It's building towards something on a timeline nobody inside the file claims to fully understand. The file also leaves genuinely open whether the Black Moon is intelligent at all, or simply an impartial force that happens to look purposeful from the outside. That ambiguity isn't a gap the writers forgot to fill in. It's load-bearing. An enemy with a comprehensible motive can eventually be negotiated with, tricked, or appeased. An impartial force can only be delayed, and every strategy the file describes across its entire timeline reads exactly like an organization that has quietly accepted it may only ever be buying time rather than winning outright. That acceptance shows up structurally, too, in how the file's containment procedures are worded. Rather than a numbered list of physical barriers, the way most Cater-class files open, this one asks for something closer to an intelligence sharing pipeline. Every discovery made about any other anomaly, anywhere in the Foundation's operations, that could conceivably help against SCP-001 is to be funneled directly to Site-01. Its containment procedure written like a standing research mandate rather than a lock on a door, because for this particular threat, there simply isn't a door to lock. One footnote buried in the file does more world-building in a single line than most SCP entries manage in an entire page. The Black Moon, it notes, isn't the only name history has given this entity. Other designations exist across other cultures and eras. The Pale Emperor. The Pit Finale. Sit with that list for a second, because it's doing exactly what it's meant to do. 4 completely different names from what are implied to be 4 completely different points in human history, all converging on the same entity. That's not decoration. That's evidence the file wants you to notice on your own. Humanity has been quietly aware of this thing, under one label or another, for a very, very long time, long before anyone called it SCP-001, long before there was a Foundation at all to assign it a number. Compare that naming pattern to how this channel's earlier episode described the mission statement itself. Secure, contain, protect. 3 words meant to sound modern, procedural, faintly corporate. Set beside the Pale Emperor, the Pit, and Finale, that contrast becomes the entire emotional register of this file in miniature. An ancient, mythic terror gradually being rebranded generation after generation into paperwork. Not because the terror got any smaller, because paperwork was the only language the people fighting it had left that let them keep functioning day to day without collapsing under what they actually knew. It reframes the entire premise of the file. This isn't a new discovery the Foundation stumbled into during some ordinary decade of operations. It's the oldest fear on record, one that different civilizations kept independently rediscovering and independently naming right up until one civilization finally organized itself specifically to fight back. There's a sobering implication tucked inside that pattern, too. If multiple, unconnected civilizations across history each developed their own name and their own mythology around the same entity, and none of those civilizations are still around to compare notes, the file quietly raises a question it never answers directly. What happened to the people who first started keeping track of the Pale Emperor or the Pit or Finale? The file doesn't claim the Black Moon ended them. It doesn't have to. The silence where that answer should be does the job on its own. Here's the detail that turns this file from an abstract cosmic threat into something genuinely unsettling for anyone who's watched documentaries on this channel before. Multiple historical and prehistorical sources cited in the file claim the Black Moon is incapable of acting while it's being directly observed. The file itself is careful, almost suspiciously careful, to point out that none of those historical sources actually confirm this approach ever worked. And there's a practical complication layered on top of that uncertainty. Because the Black Moon doesn't exist within conventional reality and acts remotely, direct observation of it isn't even currently possible for the Foundation to attempt. It's a rule everyone believes that nobody has ever been able to test. If that premise sounds familiar, it should. It's the exact same behavioral rule this channel has covered before attached to one of the most recognizable anomalies in the entire archive. The statue that only moves when no one is looking at it directly. That connection isn't coincidence, and it isn't subtle once you know to look for it. This proposal ties its central threat directly into objects this channel has already introduced you to, suggesting some of the archive's most iconic anomalies were never random discoveries at all. They were built. That reframing changes how you're meant to feel about every containment cell holding one of those objects. What used to read as a self-contained horror story, one dangerous object, one procedure, one team of researchers keeping watch, becomes something closer to a single soldier standing post in a war most of that team never had clearance to know they were fighting. The horror doesn't go away. It just gets a lot bigger and a lot lonelier for whoever built it that way on purpose. It's also a clever piece of archive-wide world building on the wiki's part, whether or not that was the original intention. An expansive, collaborative fiction project written by thousands of different authors over almost 2 decades inevitably ends up with anomalies that feel disconnected from one another because in the most literal sense, they were written by people who never coordinated with each other at all. Proposals like this one give dedicated readers a way to imagine a hidden thread tying a handful of those disconnected pieces back together without ever forcing that connection onto the rest of the archive. It's an optional layer of meaning, sitting quietly underneath files that already worked perfectly well without it. Which brings us to Project Oromasdes, the Foundation's standing countermeasure program against SCP-001, dedicated to the intentional creation and modification of anomalous objects specifically designed to help contain or neutralize the Black Moon. The file credits a researcher named Dr. Moto with one of the project's most consequential efforts, a sub-program built specifically around the observation rule we just covered. If the Black Moon truly cannot act while watched, then the logical countermeasure is horrifyingly simple. Build something else that follows the same rule and use it as a kind of ward. Multiple objects came out of that research effort, seeded quietly into the wider Foundation archive rather than kept isolated as a single specialized project. 2 names stand out immediately to anyone who already knows this channel's back catalog: the statue that only moves unobserved, and another anomaly tied to the same research thread that this community has spent years treating as one of the archive's more overlooked entries. Think about what that implies for a moment. Some of the objects treated for years as isolated, self-contained horror stories were never isolated at all. They were deliberately manufactured components in a single, much larger, much older war, one most Foundation researchers working directly with those objects likely never even knew they were fighting. It also recontextualizes Dr. Moto as one of the more quietly important figures in this entire proposal, someone whose name most casual readers of this archive would never recognize on its own, working on a project whose true purpose was compartmentalized away from almost everyone else in the organization. That's the same compartmentalization logic we broke down in our orientation episode, taken to its most extreme possible conclusion. Even the objects meant to protect the Foundation from its oldest enemy were kept secret from the Foundation itself. Every proposal we cover in this archive eventually asks you to reconsider someone you thought you already understood, and this file does exactly that with the most powerful, least visible figure in the entire Foundation hierarchy. The Administrator. According to the wider narrative built around this proposal, the Administrator wasn't always the distant, mythologized authority sitting above even the O5 Council. He begins in the deepest layers of this story, as an ordinary human being who witnesses the Black Moon's influence firsthand, centuries before any Foundation exists to give the threat a case number. What follows isn't a single dramatic confrontation. It's a lifetime, extended for reasons the file only gestures toward, spent building the exact organization we've spent 2 episodes on this channel explaining. Sites, task forces, an entire clandestine bureaucracy assembled one countermeasure at a time, all aimed at a single unfinished fight against an enemy most of the people carrying out that fight will never be told the true name of. That reframes the Administrator's role across this entire archive. He isn't simply the Foundation's founder, sitting quietly above the O5 Council for the sake of mystique. In this proposal, he's the last living witness to a war that started before written history, still directing containment efforts personally at Site-01 centuries later, because he is functionally the only person who has been present for the entire timeline and understands what's actually at stake if it's ever lost. It also explains a detail our orientation episode could only gesture toward. We told you the Administrator sits above even the O5 Council, credited with writing the Foundation's original mission statement, and left the reason why deliberately vague, because most 001 proposals leave it vague too. This one doesn't. In this specific reading of the archive, Secure, Contain, Protect wasn't written by a committee or a founding board or a government agency. It was written by one exhausted man who had already been fighting this exact war, alone, for longer than any nation on the file's own timeline had existed. As the timeline stretches forward, further than almost any other file in this archive dares to go, the fight against the Black Moon eventually requires help the Foundation can't manufacture on Earth alone. That help arrives in the form of an entity the wider narrative designates SCP-001-SAGE, an alien intelligence encountered by Foundation successors operating well beyond any timeframe most viewers of this channel would consider recognizable history. SCP-001-SAGE isn't framed as a weapon, it's framed as a partner, one carrying its own exhausted history with entities like the Black Moon, having apparently watched other civilizations across other worlds face similar entropic threats before humanity ever did. Some of the file's most quietly devastating dialogue happens between SCP-001-SAGE and a version of the Administrator so many centuries removed from his original human life that he openly admits to losing track of how much of himself he's left behind along the way. The two of them communicate at points almost telepathically. SCP-001 SAGE, noting at one point that it can hardly ignore the Administrator's mind even if it wanted to, as though centuries of carrying the exact same unbroken burden has left an imprint loud enough for another species entirely to pick up on without effort. That detail lands harder than almost anything else in the file. After everything the Administrator has built, every countermeasure, every site, every generation of researchers who served without ever meeting him directly, the one being in the entire narrative who seems to genuinely understand what he's been carrying isn't human and isn't even from this planet. It's in this exchange that the file finally addresses the cost of everything we've covered so far. Not the cost in casualties, though those are real too, but the cost paid by the one person who never got permission to stop fighting. The Administrator, by his own account, remembers people who loved him once, a very long time ago. He isn't certain how much more of himself he has left to give the fight before there's nothing left to spend. There's a specific line in that exchange, one of the most quoted moments in the entire proposal, where the administrator asks SCP-001-SA-GE something almost childlike in how simply it's phrased, whether it has ever watched a sky darken as night fell and the stars slowly came into view. It's such an ordinary human question, coming from a figure the rest of this archive treats as something closer to myth than man, and it's exactly that ordinariness that makes the moment land. Underneath every layer of clearance, every layer of command structure, every layer of centuries this file has piled on top of him, the administrator is, in the end, still asking the same small questions anyone facing the end of something long and difficult eventually asks. Longtime readers of this proposal have pointed out, correctly, that its structure borrows the shape of a much older piece of science fiction, a story about an impossibly long timeline spent fighting against entropy itself, escalating across era after era until a single, final line closes the entire narrative. This file follows that same structure closely enough that it feels less like coincidence and more like a deliberate homage, right down to sharing its closing words with that earlier story. Without spoiling the specific final beat for viewers who want to read the full proposal themselves, the ending resolves around a transfer, a burden carried alone for an almost incomprehensible length of time, finally handed to someone else. Because carrying it alone was never sustainable, no matter how badly the person carrying it wanted to believe otherwise. That older story's closing line, the one this proposal deliberately echoes, is a command spoken into darkness after entropy itself has finally been answered. This file borrows that same phrase for its own final beat, and the effect is deliberate layering rather than simple imitation. It's the file quietly telling its readers that this entire war, all of it, the ancient obliterations, the nursery rhyme password, the alien ally, the exhausted immortal founder, was always building toward the exact same kind of ending older science fiction has been reaching for since long before this archive existed. A beginning, disguised as an ending, arriving only after an almost unbearable length of waiting. It's rare for a file in this archive to end on anything resembling hope. This one doesn't fully commit to hope either, but it ends on something adjacent to it, which, after the sheer scale of what this file has just walked you through, feels like its own kind of quiet miracle. It's worth noting, too, that the file never confirms what happens to the administrator himself once the burden is finally shared, whether that means an ending in the gentlest sense, or simply a different, lighter version of the same fight continuing under new terms, is left entirely to the reader. Given how carefully this proposal has handled every other unresolved question along the way, that final silence feels less like an oversight and more like the last piece of restraint the file has left to spend. Out of the many proposals competing for this exact same number, this one has earned a reputation for going bigger in almost every direction than nearly any other entry in the collection, bigger in timeline, stretching across millennia rather than a single event. Bigger in cast, weaving in anomalies this channel has already covered as though they were always secretly connected. Bigger in emotional scope, spending real sustained attention on a figure this archive usually keeps at arm's length. What keeps it from collapsing under its own ambition is restraint in exactly the places that matter. The file never explains the Black Moon completely. It never confirms whether the entity is truly intelligent or simply an impartial force of nature wearing the shape of a villain. It lets the observation rule stay unproven. It lets the administrator's exhaustion stay understated rather than melodramatic. For a story this large, that discipline is what makes it feel earned rather than exhausting. There's also a structural achievement here that's easy to overlook on a first pass. Most long-running fiction on this archive accumulates its scale gradually, across dozens of separate authors contributing over years. This proposal builds a comparable sense of scale inside a single, self-contained piece of writing, using the same techniques this channel keeps pointing to across every episode. Clinical documentation for the parts that need distance, intimate second-person or dialogue-driven prose for the parts that need to land emotionally, and enough connective tissue to older, already familiar anomalies that the scale never feels invented purely for effect. It earns its size the same way the rest of this archive earns its horror, by respecting the reader enough to leave some of the work to them. And as with every 001 proposal on this channel, it's worth repeating plainly. This is one answer among many, not the answer. Somewhere in that same numbered slot, S.D. Locke's son is still ending the world a different way entirely, and neither version has to yield to the other to remain worth telling. What's striking, sitting these two proposals side by side, is how differently they each treat the same underlying fear. Locke's proposal is about an ending that arrives all at once, total and immediate, with no time left to prepare for it once it starts. Tanhony's proposal is about an ending that's been arriving slowly for thousands of years, one obliteration at a time, fought against continuously by someone who never got the luxury of being caught off guard. Immediate catastrophe against slow motion inevitability. Between the two of them, they cover almost every register apocalyptic horror on this archive is capable of reaching. So that's SCP-001, Tanhony's proposal, the Black Moon. An entropic god with no confirmed motive, hiding behind a nursery rhyme that only works if you already know the correct answer. A weapons program built out of objects this channel already introduced you to as something else entirely. And underneath all of it, one man who started this fight as an ordinary human being and never once got permission to put it down. If there's one thing worth carrying out of this episode and into everything else this channel covers going forward, it's this. Every clinical, distant, bureaucratic file we've ever broken down together was written that way for a reason. And that reason is rarely indifference. Sometimes, as this proposal makes clearer than almost anything else in the archive, the coldest paperwork is being kept by the warmest, most exhausted hands imaginable, simply because paperwork was the only way left to keep going. Does the Black Moon howl? No. Say it back correctly, and maybe you get to keep going a little longer. That's the whole deal this file offers anyone standing close enough to hear the question. I'm Shroudex. See you in the dark.